What if everything you learned about God's chosen people was backwards? What if the greatest deception in human history wasn't hidden in some secret vault, but displayed openly in churches, museums, and Hollywood movies across the world? Tonight, we're going to shatter a lie so massive, so carefully constructed, that it has fooled billions of people for centuries. The children of Israel, God's chosen people, the bloodline of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they didn't look like the paintings on your Sunday school walls. They looked nothing like the movies you've watched your entire life. Here's what the establishment doesn't want you to know. The real Israelites, the ones who walked with Moses through the wilderness, the ones who built Solomon's temple, the ones who witnessed Christ himself, they had dark skin. Not tan, not Mediterranean olive, but dark. And we're about to prove it using the very book they claim to follow, the Bible itself. You think you're ready for this truth? You think your faith can handle what we're about to reveal? Because once you see what we're about to show you, there's no going back. Every nativity scene, every biblical movie, every stained glass window depicting blonde-haired, blue-eyed Israelites becomes a monument to the greatest identity theft in human history. The evidence has been hiding in plain sight for 2,000 years. It's written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. It's confirmed by archaeology, supported by DNA science, and validated by historical records that predate European colonialism by millennia. But somehow, mysteriously, this truth got buried beneath centuries of deliberate mistranslation, cultural appropriation, and systematic rewriting of history. Tonight, we're digging it up. We're going to examine the biblical text word by word, cross-reference it with ancient sources, and connect it to modern scientific discoveries that confirm what the scriptures have been saying all along. We're going to travel back to the ancient Near East, walk through the markets of Jerusalem, and see the faces that actually populated the biblical world. But first, let me ask you something. Why does this matter? Why should you care about the skin color of people who lived thousands of years ago? Because identity matters, truth matters, and when you steal someone's identity, when you erase their history and replace it with your own image, you commit a crime against God himself. You violate the very commandment that says, "Thou shalt not steal." For centuries, European colonizers didn't just steal land, gold, and bodies, they stole identities. They took the heroes of the Bible, the prophets, the kings, the very Son of God himself, and they painted them in their own image. They turned dark-skinned Semitic people into European-looking figures that matched their own reflection. This wasn't accidental. This was systematic. This was strategic, and it worked so well that even the descendants of the original biblical people started believing the lie. Even they started thinking that God's chosen people must have been white because that's what they saw in every church, every book, every piece of religious art. But the Bible tells a different story. And tonight, we're going to let the Bible speak for itself. We're going to examine passages that have been mistranslated, misinterpreted, and deliberately obscured. We're going to look at Hebrew words that paint a picture so clear, so obvious, that you'll wonder how anyone ever missed it. Are you ready to have your worldview challenged? Are you prepared to question everything you thought you knew about biblical history? Because what we're about to reveal isn't just going to change how you see the past, it's going to transform how you understand the present. It's going to explain patterns of oppression, systems of injustice, and spiritual warfare that has been raging for millennia. The truth about God's chosen people isn't hidden in some secret scroll locked away in a Vatican vault. It's written plainly in the Bible you probably have sitting on your shelf right now. The Hebrew text, the Greek manuscripts, the Aramaic traditions, they all tell the same story. A story that's been whitewashed, literally and figuratively, by centuries of European interpretation. What lies buried in these ancient texts will shock you. Can you handle this level of truth? Because once we open this door, once we start pulling on this thread, The entire tapestry of modern Christianity starts to unravel. Everything you thought you knew about race, about chosen people, about biblical prophecy, it all changes. Let's start with something simple, something that should make every Christian pause and think. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 7. God, speaking to his chosen people, tells them exactly why he selected them. Not because they were numerous, not because they were powerful, not because they controlled vast empires or had superior technology or ruled over other nations. The Lord did not set his love upon you, nor choose you, because you were more in number than any people, for you were the fewest of all people, the fewest. The smallest group, the minorities. God specifically chose the underdogs, the ones who would be overlooked, dismissed, and oppressed by the dominant powers of the world. Now think about that for a moment. Think about the implications. If God chose the fewest people, if he specifically selected a minority group to be his covenant nation, then why do we see biblical Israelites depicted as members of the dominant majority populations? Why do they look like Europeans when Europeans have historically been among the most numerous, most powerful, most dominant people groups on earth? This contradiction should make every thinking person stop and question what they've been taught. The Bible explicitly states that God chose the fewest people, yet popular Christianity depicts these people as looking exactly like the groups that have historically held the most power, controlled the most territory, and dominated the most populations. Something doesn't add up. Something's been deliberately twisted, and it gets deeper than you might imagine. The Hebrew word used in Deuteronomy 7:7 for fewest is me'at. It doesn't just mean small in number. It carries connotations of being insignificant, overlooked, and dismissed by worldly standards. It's the same root used to describe people who are marginalized, forgotten, and pushed to the edges of society. God didn't choose the people who would naturally rise to power through human systems. He chose the people who would be despised, rejected, and oppressed by those very systems. He chose people who would know what it means to cry out for justice, to suffer under the weight of other people's hatred, to experience what it truly means to need a savior. This theme runs throughout the entire Old Testament. Again and again, God selects the younger brother over the older, the servant over the master, the shepherd over the king. He elevates the lowly and humbles the proud. He makes the first last and the last first. But somehow, in our modern interpretation, we've flipped this completely upside down. We've made God's chosen people look like the very groups that have historically held the most privilege, the most power, the most advantage in human societies. We've turned the biblical narrative into a story that validates existing power structures rather than challenging them. The prophet Amos understood this principle perfectly. In chapter 9, verse 7, he delivers a message that should shake every person who thinks they understand God's selection process. "Are you not like the Ethiopians to me, O children of Israel, says the Lord? Have I not brought up Israel from the land of Egypt, just as I brought up the Philistines from Caphtor and the Syrians from Kir?" Read that again slowly. God compares his chosen people, the Israelites, directly to the Ethiopians, not metaphorically, not symbolically. He says they are like Ethiopians to him. The Hebrew word used here is k'chaveshim, Kushim, referring specifically to the dark-skinned people of ancient Ethiopia, modern-day Sudan, and Ethiopia. This isn't a casual comparison. This is God himself drawing a direct parallel between his covenant people and one of the darkest-skinned populations known to the ancient world. The Ethiopians were famous throughout the ancient Near East for their dark complexion. Greek historians wrote about them. Roman writers described them. Egyptian art depicted them with distinctly African features. When God says the Israelites are like Ethiopians to him, he's making a statement about their appearance, their status, and their position in the world. Just as Ethiopians were often viewed as outsiders, as different, as people who didn't fit the standard image of power and dominance in ancient Mediterranean societies, so too were the Israelites. This comparison becomes even more powerful when you understand the historical context. Amos was prophesying during a time when Israel had become prosperous and proud. They had started to think of themselves as superior to other nations. They had begun to believe that their covenant with God made them inherently better than everyone else. But God, through Amos, reminds them of their true identity. You are like Ethiopians to me. You are not the dominant power. You are not the majority. You are not the ones who get to look down on others. You are the ones who have been lifted up by my grace, just like I have lifted up other oppressed peoples throughout history. The message is clear. God's chosen people were never meant to be the oppressors. They were meant to identify with the oppressed. They were never meant to be the dominant majority. They were meant to understand what it means to be marginalized, displaced, and misunderstood. Yet somehow modern Christianity has completely reversed this message. Instead of seeing God's chosen people as identifying with the Ethiopians, with the marginalized, with the oppressed minorities of the world, we've turned them into the oppressors. We've made them look like the very people who have historically held power over others. This reversal isn't just historically inaccurate. It's spiritually devastating. It turns the gospel message upside down. Instead of God standing with the oppressed against their oppressors, it makes God appear to validate existing systems of dominance and control. But the biblical text won't let us get away with this deception. It keeps pointing us back to the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might make us feel. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 14, verse 2, we find another piece of this puzzle that most people have never seen clearly. Judah mourns, and her gates languish. They are black unto the ground, and the cry of Jerusalem is gone up. The Hebrew word translated as black here is kadar, which means to be dark, to mourn, to be blackened. Now, most commentators try to explain this away as purely metaphorical. They say it's just talking about the darkness of mourning, the spiritual condition of the people. But the Hebrew language is more specific than that. The word kadar doesn't just mean spiritually dark. It refers to actual blackness, to the kind of darkness you can see with your eyes. The text is saying that when Judah mourns, when the people are in distress, they become black unto the ground. Their natural response to grief, to suffering, to oppression, is to display their blackness. This suggests that blackness was their natural state, their default condition, not something that only appeared during times of mourning. Think about this logically. If someone becomes black when they mourn, what color were they to begin with? If darkness is their response to grief, then darkness must be their natural complexion, showing through whatever artificial lightness they might have displayed during better times. This pattern appears throughout the Old Testament. Again and again, we see references to the children of Israel displaying darkness, blackness, and burnt complexions in response to various circumstances. But these references have been systematically mistranslated, reinterpreted, and explained away by commentators who couldn't accept the obvious implications. In Lamentations chapter 4, verse 8, we find perhaps the most explicit description of Israelite appearance in the entire Bible. Their visage is blacker than a coal. They are not known in the streets. Their skin cleaves to their bones. It is withered. It has become like a stick. The Hebrew word for blacker here is chashak, which means dark, black, to be or become dark. But notice what the text is comparing them to. Not just black, but blacker than coal. This isn't metaphorical language. This is a direct physical description of how these people looked. The verse goes on to say they are not known in the streets. Why? Because their appearance had changed? Because they looked different than expected? Or because their true appearance was finally being revealed after years of being hidden or disguised? The phrase "their skin cleaves to their bones" suggests people who had been deprived, starved, reduced to their most basic physical appearance. When you strip away all the external trappings, all the artificial enhancements, all the cultural modifications, what's left? Their natural skin color, their true ethnic identity, their authentic genetic heritage. And that authentic heritage, according to the biblical text, was black, blacker than coal. Dark enough that it would be immediately noticeable, immediately recognizable, immediately significant to anyone who saw them. But here's where it gets really interesting. The text says they are not known in the streets. In Hebrew, the word for known is nakar, which means to recognize, to acknowledge, to identify. These people were no longer being recognized or acknowledged for who they really were. This sounds exactly like what happens when someone's true identity has been stolen, erased, or replaced with a false image. People stop recognizing the real version because they've become accustomed to the fake one. They stop acknowledging the authentic because they've been trained to accept the counterfeit. For centuries, the true image of biblical Israelites has not been known in the streets. People walk past their descendants every day without recognizing them. They see their features in museums, in documentaries, in archaeological discoveries, but they don't make the connection because they've been programmed to look for something completely different. The princes of Israel, according to this same chapter in Lamentations, were purer than snow, whiter than milk, more ruddy in body than rubies. But then something happened. Now their form is darker than blackness. They are not recognized in the streets. What changed? What transformed these people from their original state to their current condition? The text suggests they went through a period of suffering, oppression, and displacement that revealed their true ethnic identity. The artificial whiteness, the cultural modifications, the external trappings of privilege and power were stripped away, leaving only their authentic genetic heritage. Their authentic heritage was black, so black that it required specific mention in the biblical text. So black that it became a defining characteristic of their identity, so black that it marked them as different, as other, as people who didn't fit the standard expectations of power and privilege in ancient societies. This brings us to a crucial question that most people have never considered. If the biblical Israelites were indeed dark-skinned, if they looked like Ethiopians, if their natural appearance was black enough to be compared to coal, then where did the white Jesus come from? Where did the European-looking Moses originate? How did blonde-haired, blue-eyed biblical characters become the standard representation of God's chosen people? The answer lies in one of the most systematic campaigns of cultural appropriation in human history. It began during the early centuries of Christianity, accelerated during the medieval period, and reached its peak during the age of European colonialism. It was a deliberate, calculated effort to remake biblical characters in European images, to transfer the spiritual heritage of dark-skinned peoples to light-skinned populations. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't the natural result of artistic interpretation or cultural translation. This was a strategic campaign designed to support specific political and economic objectives. If you could convince people that God's chosen people looked like Europeans, then you could justify European dominance over other populations. If you could make Jesus appear white, then you could claim divine endorsement for white supremacy. The process involved multiple levels of deception. First, the systematic mistranslation of key Hebrew and Greek terms that described physical appearance. Second, the creation of artistic representations that gradually shifted biblical characters from Semitic to European features. Third, the development of theological interpretations that spiritualized away any references to ethnic identity or physical characteristics. Over time, these false images became so embedded in Christian culture that people forgot they were ever false. They became the default assumption, the unquestioned norm, the standard against which all other interpretations were measured. Anyone who suggested that biblical characters might have looked different was dismissed as radical, unorthodox, or politically motivated. But the Hebrew text never changed. The original manuscripts never supported these European interpretations. The archaeological evidence never validated these white representations. The DNA research never confirmed these light-skinned theories. All the actual evidence pointed in the opposite direction, toward a dark-skinned, African-looking population of biblical Israelites. The Hebrew language itself preserves clues that have been hidden for centuries. The word brai, ivri, meaning Hebrew, comes from a root that suggests crossing over, passing through, being a stranger or foreigner. It implies people who don't belong to the dominant culture, who stand out as different, who are immediately recognizable as outsiders. In the ancient Near East, what would make someone immediately recognizable as foreign, as different, as not belonging to the local population? Their skin color, their ethnic features, their genetic heritage that marked them as coming from somewhere else, as representing a different lineage, as carrying the blood of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The patriarch Abraham himself was called to leave his country, his family, his familiar surroundings, and journey to a land where he would be a stranger. The Hebrew word for stranger here is ger, which implies someone whose appearance marks them as foreign, whose ethnic identity sets them apart from the local population. Abraham's journey from Mesopotamia to Canaan wasn't just geographical. It was ethnic, cultural, and genetic. He was carrying a bloodline, a genetic heritage, a physical appearance that would make his descendants recognizable as his offspring for thousands of years. That heritage, according to biblical descriptions, included dark skin, African features, and Ethiopian-like characteristics. The covenant promises made to Abraham weren't just spiritual, they were genetic. God promised to make his seed as numerous as the stars of heaven, as the sand on the seashore. He promised that in Abraham's seed all nations of the earth would be blessed. This was a bloodline promise, a DNA covenant, a genetic heritage that would be passed down through physical reproduction. If Abraham's genetic heritage included dark skin, then all his descendants would carry that same genetic information. Isaac would be dark-skinned, Jacob would be dark-skinned, the 12 tribes of Israel would be dark-skinned. Jesus himself, as a descendant of Abraham through the line of David, would be dark-skinned. This isn't speculation. This isn't politically motivated interpretation. This is simple genetics combined with biblical genealogy and historical documentation. The evidence all points in the same direction, toward a dark-skinned population of biblical Israelites who look nothing like the European representations that dominate modern Christianity. But why does this matter? Why should contemporary believers care about the skin color of ancient biblical characters? Because truth matters. Because identity matters. Because understanding who God really chose helps us understand what God really values. When you realize that God specifically chose dark-skinned people to be his covenant nation, when you understand that Jesus himself had African features, when you recognize that the entire biblical narrative is centered around people who looked like modern-day Africans and their descendants, everything changes. It changes how you read the Bible. It changes how you understand prophecy. It changes how you interpret current events. It changes how you see justice issues. It changes how you understand the spiritual warfare that has been raging for centuries between truth and deception, between authentic identity and stolen heritage. The implications go far beyond ancient history. They reach into every aspect of contemporary Christianity, every theological discussion, every social justice issue, every political debate. When you understand that God's chosen people were the oppressed, not the oppressors, when you realize that Jesus identified with the marginalized, not the privileged, when you recognize that biblical prophecy is about the restoration of scattered, despised peoples, not the continued dominance of already powerful groups, everything shifts. This isn't about creating division between different ethnic groups. This isn't about promoting hatred or resentment between races. This is about restoring truth, reclaiming stolen identity, and returning to the authentic biblical narrative that has been buried under centuries of deliberate deception. The goal isn't to take anything away from anyone. The goal is to give back what was stolen. To return the biblical heritage to its rightful inheritors, to restore the true image of God's chosen people, to let Jesus look like Jesus actually looked. To let Moses appear as Moses actually appeared. To let the biblical narrative speak for itself without European interpretation or colonial filtering. This restoration of truth serves everyone's interests. White Christians benefit because they finally get to see the real Jesus, the authentic biblical characters, the true heroes of faith. They get to connect with a God who chose the oppressed over the oppressors, who elevated the lowly over the mighty, who stands with justice over privilege. Dark-skinned people benefit because they finally get to see themselves in the biblical narrative, to recognize their own features in the heroes of faith, to understand that God's covenant promises were made to people who looked like them, who experienced oppression like they have experienced, who know what it means to cry out for justice and deliverance. All people benefit because truth always serves everyone better than deception. Understanding the authentic biblical narrative helps everyone better comprehend God's heart for justice, his concern for the oppressed, his plan to elevate the lowly and humble the proud. What lies buried beneath centuries of European interpretation will revolutionize Christianity. Can you handle this level of transformation? Are you ready to see Jesus as he really was? Are you prepared to meet Moses as he actually looked? Can you accept that God's chosen people were dark-skinned, African-featured, ethnically similar to modern-day people groups that have been historically oppressed and marginalized? The Hebrew scriptures contain dozens of additional references that support this interpretation. In Song of Solomon chapter 1 verse 5, the beloved declares, "I am black but comely, O you daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon." The Hebrew word for black here is shekara, which means dark, dusky, or black-skinned. Some translations try to soften this by rendering it as dark or swarthy, but the Hebrew is clear. The speaker is identifying herself as black-skinned, and she's doing so in a way that suggests this is her natural, beautiful, God-given appearance. She's not apologizing for her blackness. She's celebrating it as part of her identity as one of God's people. The comparison to the tents of Kedar is particularly significant. Kedar was a region in Arabia inhabited by dark-skinned peoples. The tents of Kedar were made from black goat hair and were known throughout the ancient world for their distinctive dark appearance. To compare oneself to the tents of Kedar was to emphasize blackness as a defining characteristic. The phrase "but comely" reveals the prejudice that even ancient people had against dark skin. The speaker has to assert that despite being black, she is still beautiful, still worthy, still acceptable. This suggests that dark-skinned people in the biblical world faced discrimination and prejudice similar to what they face today. But God chose these very people to be his covenant nation. He selected people who would face racial prejudice, ethnic discrimination, and color-based persecution. He chose people who would understand what it means to be judged by appearance rather than character, to be dismissed because of genetics rather than evaluated based on merit. This theme continues throughout the biblical narrative. Joseph, when he was sold into slavery in Egypt, was able to blend in with the Egyptian population so completely that his own brothers didn't recognize him when they came to buy grain during the famine. How could a Hebrew blend in perfectly with Egyptians if there was a significant difference in skin color or ethnic features? The answer is obvious. There wasn't a significant difference. Joseph looked Egyptian because he was genetically similar to Egyptians. He had dark skin, African features and ethnic characteristics that allowed him to pass as a native Egyptian even to people who knew him intimately. Ancient Egyptians, according to their own artwork, their own writings, and modern DNA analysis of mummified remains, were predominantly dark-skinned. They depicted themselves with dark complexions in their tomb paintings. They described themselves using terms that emphasized their African heritage. They considered themselves part of the African continent, not separate from it. If Joseph could pass as Egyptian, if Moses could be raised as Egyptian royalty, if the entire Israelite population could live in Egypt for 400 years and only be distinguishable by their religious practices rather than their physical appearance, then the Israelites must have looked very similar to Egyptians. And Egyptians looked African. They had dark skin, broad features, and genetic heritage that linked them to sub-Saharan African populations. Modern DNA studies of ancient Egyptian remains consistently show African genetic markers, not European or Middle Eastern ones. The Book of Numbers, chapter 12, provides another crucial piece of evidence that most people overlook. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married. The Hebrew word for Ethiopian here is Cushite, referring specifically to a woman from the land of Cush, which encompassed modern-day Sudan and Ethiopia. If Moses married an Ethiopian woman, and if this marriage was acceptable to God even though it caused controversy among some Israelites, what does this tell us about Moses' own ethnic background? If there had been a significant difference in skin color or ethnic features between Moses and his Ethiopian wife, this would have been mentioned explicitly in the text, but the controversy wasn't about appearance. It was about tribal identity, about marrying outside the covenant community, about leadership dynamics within the Israelite camp. The text doesn't suggest that Moses' Ethiopian wife looked different from other Israelite women. It suggests that she came from a different tribal group, a different national identity. This implies that Israelites and Ethiopians looked similar enough that physical appearance wasn't the issue. The issue was cultural and religious, not racial or ethnic in terms of physical features. Moses could marry an Ethiopian woman without creating visual contradiction because Israelites and Ethiopians shared similar genetic heritage and physical characteristics. The prophet Zephaniah, in chapter 3, verse 10, speaks of worshippers coming from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, from the daughter of my dispersed. The Hebrew phrase, amputzai, refers to God's scattered people. These scattered people are located beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, in the heart of Africa. If God's people were scattered into Africa, if they settled beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, if they established communities in the heart of the African continent, then they must have been able to blend in with African populations. They must have shared similar physical characteristics, similar genetic heritage, similar ethnic features. You can't be scattered among people who look completely different from you and expect to survive, thrive, and maintain your cultural identity for thousands of years. You can only successfully integrate into populations that share your basic genetic characteristics while maintaining your distinct religious and cultural practices. The biblical evidence for dark-skinned Israelites isn't limited to a few isolated verses. It runs throughout the entire Old and New Testaments. It appears in genealogies, in prophetic visions, in historical narratives, in poetic descriptions, in legal codes, and in messianic prophecies. Jesus himself, according to the book of Revelation, is described with very specific physical characteristics that contradict European artistic representations. His head and his hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace. The description of feet like fine brass that has been burned in a furnace is particularly significant. Brass that has been heated to extreme temperatures takes on a very dark, almost black appearance. This isn't metaphorical language. This is a specific physical description of skin color that looks like dark, burnished metal. The comparison of hair to wool is also revealing. Wool has a specific texture, a particular appearance that doesn't match straight, European-style hair. It matches the tightly curled, densely packed hair texture that's characteristic of African populations. The description suggests hair that looks like sheep's wool, which has a distinctly kinky, coiled appearance. These physical descriptions of the glorified Christ match the ethnic characteristics of ancient Semitic peoples who were genetically similar to African populations. They don't match European features, European hair textures, or European skin tones. The Apostle Paul, writing to various churches throughout the Roman Empire, makes several references that suggest the ethnic identity of early Christian communities. In his letter to the Galatians, he speaks of being persecuted for the cross of Christ, of bearing in his body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Paul's persecution wasn't just religious, it was ethnic. He faced discrimination because he looked like a Jew, because he carried the physical characteristics of Abraham's descendants, because his appearance marked him as one of God's chosen people in a Roman world that looked down on dark-skinned populations. The early Christian church, according to historical records, was predominantly made up of people from Africa, Asia Minor, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The major theological centers of early Christianity were in places like Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople, not in Rome or Northern Europe. African church fathers like Augustine, Athanasius, and Origen played crucial roles in developing Christian theology, establishing orthodox doctrine, and defending the faith against heretical movements. These weren't European thinkers imposing foreign ideas on Christianity. These were indigenous African intellectuals working within their own cultural and ethnic context to understand and explain the gospel message. The transformation of Christianity from an African and Asian religion to a European one didn't happen naturally. It was the result of specific political and military developments that shifted the center of Christian power from the south and east to the north and west. The Islamic conquest of North Africa and the Middle East in the 7th and 8th centuries cut off many of the original Christian communities from contact with European churches. The Byzantine Empire's gradual weakening left Rome as the dominant Christian center in the Western world. The Crusades created an adversarial relationship between European Christianity and Middle Eastern populations. Over time, European Christianity developed its own interpretations, its own traditions, its own artistic representations that reflected European rather than biblical ethnic characteristics. These European versions gradually became the standard, the norm, the unquestioned assumption about what biblical characters must have looked like. But the original manuscripts never changed. The Hebrew and Greek texts continued to describe dark-skinned people with African features and Ethiopian characteristics. The archaeological evidence continued to point towards Semitic populations that looked more African than European. The DNA research continued to confirm genetic connections between ancient Middle Eastern peoples and modern African populations. What happened was that European Christianity simply stopped paying attention to the evidence. It developed interpretive traditions that spiritualized away any references to physical appearance. It created artistic conventions that gradually whitened biblical characters. It established theological frameworks that made ethnic identity seem irrelevant to spiritual truth. This process reached its peak during the age of European colonialism, when Christian missionaries carried European versions of biblical characters to colonized populations around the world. African slaves in America were taught to worship a white Jesus. Native American converts were shown European versions of biblical heroes. Asian Christians were introduced to Occidental representations of Middle Eastern people. The result was a global Christianity that looked nothing like the religion described in the Bible. It was a faith that had been systematically stripped of its authentic ethnic identity and clothed in European cultural clothing. It was a gospel message that had been filtered through colonial assumptions and imperial objectives. But truth has a way of surviving even the most systematic attempts at suppression. The Hebrew language preserved the original descriptions. Archaeological discoveries kept uncovering evidence that contradicted European interpretations. DNA research began revealing genetic connections that European scholars had denied for centuries. Modern technology has made it impossible to continue hiding the truth about biblical ethnic identity. Satellite imaging reveals the true geographic extent of ancient Israelite settlements. Genetic analysis confirms the African connections of Middle Eastern populations. Linguistic research traces Hebrew vocabulary back to African language families. The evidence is overwhelming, undeniable, and available to anyone who wants to investigate honestly. The only question is whether contemporary Christians are willing to accept what the evidence reveals, whether they're prepared to abandon centuries of comfortable deception in favor of uncomfortable truth. This isn't just an academic question. This isn't just a matter of historical curiosity. This is about understanding who God really chose, what God really values, and how God really works in human history. It's about recognizing that the biblical narrative is fundamentally a story about God's love for oppressed people, His commitment to justice for the marginalized, His plan to elevate the lowly and humble the proud. When you understand that God's chosen people were dark-skinned, when you realize that Jesus looked African, when you recognize that biblical heroes were ethnically similar to people who have been historically oppressed, everything about contemporary Christianity has to be reconsidered. It means that God doesn't validate existing power structures. He challenges them. It means that Jesus doesn't endorse privilege and dominance. He confronts them. It means that biblical prophecy isn't about maintaining the status quo. It's about transforming it completely. The implications for social justice are enormous. If God chose dark-skinned people to be His covenant nation, if Jesus identified with the oppressed and marginalized, if biblical prophecy promises the elevation of scattered and despised peoples, then Christians have a moral obligation to stand with oppressed populations against their oppressors. This isn't political activism disguised as theology. This is theology that necessarily leads to political action. When you understand what God really chose, you can't help but support what God supports. When you see who Jesus really was, you can't help but identify with who Jesus identified with. The restoration of authentic biblical ethnic identity isn't about taking sides in contemporary racial conflicts. It's about returning to the biblical perspective that transcends human racial categories while acknowledging that God has a special heart for people who suffer because of their ethnic identity. All people are created in God's image. All nations are precious in His sight. All ethnic groups have dignity and worth because they reflect different aspects of divine creativity. But God has consistently chosen to work through oppressed populations, marginalized communities, and scattered peoples who know what it means to cry out for justice and deliverance. Understanding this biblical pattern helps Christians better comprehend contemporary social dynamics, better respond to current justice issues, better align themselves with God's heart for the oppressed and marginalized. It doesn't create division between ethnic groups. It creates unity around God's commitment to justice for all people. The truth about God's chosen people unifies rather than divides because it reveals that God's love transcends ethnic boundaries while acknowledging that God's justice specifically addresses ethnic oppression. All people can celebrate the fact that God chose dark-skinned people to be His covenant nation because it demonstrates that God's selection process isn't based on human standards of power and privilege. God chose the despised to shame the mighty. He selected the weak to confound the strong. He elevated the lowly to humble the proud. This is good news for everyone because it means that God's love isn't limited to people who hold earthly power. It's especially available to people who have been pushed to the margins, dismissed as insignificant, or treated as less than fully human. The biblical narrative is ultimately about God's plan to restore justice, establish righteousness, and create a kingdom where the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Understanding the ethnic identity of God's chosen people helps contemporary Christians better align themselves with this divine agenda. What we've revealed tonight isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning. Once you see the truth about biblical ethnic identity, once you understand what God really chose, once you recognize who Jesus really was, you start seeing everything differently. You start reading the Bible with new eyes. You start understanding prophecy with fresh insight. You start connecting contemporary events to biblical patterns in ways you never noticed before. The evidence we've presented tonight is just a fraction of what's available. There are dozens of additional biblical references that support dark-skinned Israelite identity. There are hundreds of historical documents that confirm African connections to biblical peoples. There are thousands of archaeological artifacts that validate Middle Eastern populations with African genetic heritage. The Hebrew language itself contains vocabulary that has been systematically mistranslated to hide ethnic references. Greek manuscripts include descriptions that have been spiritualized away to avoid uncomfortable physical details. Aramaic texts preserve cultural information that contradicts European interpretations of biblical characters. Ancient Jewish writings, including the Talmud, Midrash, and other rabbinical sources, contain descriptions of Israelite appearance that match African rather than European characteristics. Early Christian writings, including works by church fathers who lived closer to biblical times, describe Jesus and the apostles in terms that suggest dark skin and African features. Islamic sources, which preserve independent traditions about biblical figures, consistently describe prophets like Moses, David, and Jesus with dark complexions and characteristics that match African rather than European ethnic groups. These Islamic descriptions weren't influenced by European Christian art because they developed independently in Arab and African contexts. All of these sources point in the same direction, toward a consistent pattern of evidence that supports dark-skinned biblical characters with African genetic heritage and Ethiopian-like physical characteristics. The only tradition that contradicts this evidence is European Christian art and interpretation, which developed during a specific historical period with specific political objectives. When you remove the European filter, when you go back to original sources, when you examine evidence that predates colonial influence, everything points toward African-looking biblical characters. This truth has been preserved in unexpected places. African-American spirituals contain references to biblical characters that assume dark-skinned identity. Traditional African religions retain memories of ancestral connections to biblical peoples. Indigenous populations around the world preserve legends that link them to scattered Israelite communities. Even European folklore contains traces of the original truth. Medieval legends speak of dark-skinned knights, African queens, and Ethiopian princes in ways that suggest these weren't exotic foreigners but familiar, recognizable figures. Renaissance art occasionally depicts biblical characters with African features before European conventions became standardized. The truth has been hidden, but it hasn't been completely erased. It survives in fragments, in scattered references, in traditional memories that predate European influence. And now, with modern research tools, with advanced technology, with global communication that allows independent verification, the complete picture is finally emerging. What we've shared tonight is just the beginning of a much larger revelation that's going to transform Christianity over the coming decades. As more people discover the truth about biblical ethnic identity, as more scholars publish honest research about Middle Eastern genetics, as more churches acknowledge the African heritage of biblical characters, The entire landscape of contemporary Christianity will shift. This isn't something that can be stopped or suppressed indefinitely. Truth has its own momentum. Once it reaches a critical mass, once enough people understand what really happened, the old deceptions become impossible to maintain. The European versions of biblical characters will be recognized as historical artifacts, not authentic representations. The white Jesus will be understood as a cultural invention, not a biblical reality. The restoration of authentic biblical ethnic identity will benefit everyone, not just people with African heritage. All Christians will finally get to meet the real Jesus, the authentic Moses, the genuine apostles. All believers will finally understand what God really chose, what God really values, what God really requires from His people. This restoration won't happen overnight. It will take time for centuries of deception to be completely undone. It will require courage from scholars willing to publish honest research despite professional risks. It will demand integrity from church leaders willing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths despite congregational resistance. It will need commitment from ordinary believers willing to question everything they've been taught despite personal discomfort. But it will happen. Truth always eventually triumphs over deception. Reality always eventually overcomes illusion. God's authentic revelation always eventually breaks through human attempts at concealment and distortion. The question isn't whether the truth about biblical ethnic identity will be revealed. The question is whether you're going to be part of the revelation process or part of the resistance to it. Are you going to help restore authentic biblical images, or are you going to cling to comfortable deceptions? Are you going to support honest scholarship, or are you going to defend traditional lies? Your choice will determine not just what you believe about ancient history, but how you respond to contemporary justice issues, how you interpret current events, how you understand your role as a Christian in a world that desperately needs to see the authentic gospel message. The real Jesus was dark-skinned, African-featured, genetically similar to modern populations that have been historically oppressed and marginalized. He identified with people who cry out for justice, not people who hold power over others. He came to liberate the captives, not to validate their captors. He chose disciples who looked like him, who shared his ethnic heritage, who understood his cultural context. This Jesus is good news for everyone because he demonstrates that God's love isn't limited by human standards of beauty, power, or privilege. But he's especially good news for people who have been told they don't measure up, who have been excluded from dominant narratives, who have been denied their rightful place in biblical history. The Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8 wasn't converting to a foreign religion. He was reconnecting with his ancestral faith. The Queen of Sheba who visited Solomon wasn't an exotic foreigner. She was a relative recognizing family connections. The wise men from the East who visited baby Jesus weren't distant strangers. They were distant cousins following ancient prophecies about their own people's promised Messiah. Understanding these connections transforms how we read the entire Bible. It reveals patterns that have been hidden for centuries. It explains relationships that have been misunderstood for generations. It restores dignity to populations that have been systematically excluded from their own spiritual heritage. This isn't about creating new divisions between ethnic groups. This is about healing ancient wounds, restoring stolen identities, and returning to biblical truth that unifies all people under God's love while acknowledging God's special concern for the oppressed and marginalized. The revelation of biblical ethnic identity is ultimately a revelation of God's character, God's values, and God's plan for human history. When you understand who God really chose, you better understand what God really wants. When you see what Jesus really looked like, you better comprehend what Jesus really taught. When you recognize the authentic biblical narrative, you better appreciate the authentic gospel message. This message is for everyone, but it's especially for people who have been excluded, marginalized, and told they don't belong in the biblical story. Your ancestors were there from the beginning. Your ethnic heritage is woven throughout the entire narrative. Your physical characteristics are described in the original texts. Your genetic connections are confirmed by modern science. You don't have to worship European versions of biblical characters. You don't have to accept colonial interpretations of ancient texts. You don't have to believe that God's chosen people look nothing like you. The truth is exactly the opposite. God's chosen people looked exactly like you. Jesus shared your ethnic heritage. The apostles had your physical characteristics. This truth should make you proud of your identity, confident in your spiritual heritage, and bold in your witness to others. You're not converting to someone else's religion. You're reclaiming your own ancestral faith. You're not adopting foreign cultural practices. You're returning to your original spiritual traditions. You're not worshipping other people's God. You're reconnecting with the God of your own people. But this message is also for people whose ethnic background doesn't match the biblical characters. You're not losing anything by accepting the truth about biblical ethnic identity. You're gaining access to the authentic gospel message, the real Jesus, the genuine biblical narrative. You're being invited to join something that's bigger, deeper, and more powerful than the European version you've known. The authentic biblical story is about God's love for all people expressed through his choice of specific people who would represent his heart for justice, mercy, and righteousness. When you understand that these specific people were dark-skinned, oppressed, and marginalized, you better understand what God requires from all his people, regardless of ethnic background. You're called to identify with the oppressed, not the oppressors. You're called to stand with the marginalized, not the privileged. You're called to support justice for all people, especially people who look like the original biblical characters. This isn't about guilt or shame. This is about alignment with God's heart and participation in God's plan. The restoration of biblical ethnic identity serves everyone's spiritual interests because it restores the authentic gospel message that calls all people to repentance, offers salvation to everyone who believes, and demands justice from all who claim to follow Christ. What we've revealed tonight will continue reverberating through Christian communities for years to come. Some will accept it immediately because it confirms what they've always suspected. Others will resist it initially because it challenges what they've always believed. But everyone will eventually have to deal with it because truth has a way of forcing itself into every conversation, every theological discussion, every biblical interpretation. The evidence is too strong to ignore. The biblical support is too clear to deny. The historical documentation is too extensive to dismiss. The scientific confirmation is too definitive to reject. The truth about God's chosen people having dark skin isn't a theory or opinion. It's a fact that's been hidden for centuries but can no longer be suppressed. Your responsibility now is to decide how you're going to respond to this truth. Are you going to investigate further and discover even more evidence that confirms what we've revealed tonight? Are you going to share this information with others who need to hear it? Are you going to adjust your understanding of biblical prophecy, contemporary justice issues, and Christian responsibility in light of what you now know? The choice is yours, but the truth remains the same regardless of your choice. God's chosen people had dark skin. Jesus looked African. The biblical characters were ethnically similar to modern populations that have been historically oppressed. This truth is written in Hebrew, confirmed by archaeology, supported by genetics, and validated by independent historical sources. You can accept it and align yourself with biblical reality, or you can resist it and cling to comfortable deceptions. But you can't change it, suppress it, or make it go away. The truth about God's chosen people is emerging into the light after centuries of darkness, and nothing can stop it from being fully revealed. Tell us what you think about tonight's revelation. Share this information with others who need to hear it. Investigate the evidence for yourself and discover even more confirmation of what we've revealed. The truth about biblical ethnic identity isn't just ancient history. It's contemporary reality with implications for every aspect of Christian faith and practice. The real question isn't whether God's chosen people had dark skin. The evidence makes that undeniable. The real question is what you're going to do now that you know the truth. How will this knowledge change your faith? How will it affect your understanding of justice? How will it influence your response to oppression? How will it shape your relationship with people who look like the original biblical characters? These are the questions that will determine whether tonight's revelation becomes a transformative truth in your life or just interesting information that you file away and forget. The choice is yours, but the truth remains the same. God chose dark-skinned people to be his covenant nation, and that choice reveals everything you need to know about God's character, God's values, and God's plan for human history.